we're going to talk about the new domestic abuse legislation, which has come into force, which gives the police and the court of law new powers to tackle new offences. It's a project that the Minister for Justice, Samantha Sacramento, has been working hard on for months, and she presented the new legislation with the Police Commissioner, Richard Ullger, and the Minister is in the studio now to discuss it with us. You must be very pleased, Ms. Sacramento, to get this over the line, because I know it's a project that means a lot to you.
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for the invitation to come. And yes, most certainly, this has been a piece of work that has been years in the making. So it's absolutely fantastic to be able to be in this position where the law that we passed in January has now come into effect. The law, as you said, introduces new provisions. Included in that are new criminal offences. One of the important ones, which was a gap in our existing legislation, is the new criminal offence of coercive behaviour. Until now, domestic abuse really has been limited to acts of violence, but it no longer is under the new legislation. Coercive control is something that is sometimes difficult to understand. A lot of victims who find themselves in situations of coercive control don't even know that they are victims of domestic abuse. So we're trying to raise as much awareness on that subject as possible.
So one of the things that you've done is to launch a social media campaign, and we can play a clip that the government has produced to help us to understand what coercive behaviour and coercive abuse means.
Isolating you from family, friends and support networks. Choosing what you wear. Taking away your keys. Using intimidation or humiliating you. Controlling your finances and limiting your access to money. Using location tracking to monitor your every move. Monitoring your phone calls, emails and social media. These are all examples of different forms of coercive control. Coercive control is a crime. Report it. Call the Royal Gibraltar Police on 200 725 00.
So that does give us a very helpful steer. The Justice Minister, Samantha Sacramento, is in the studio. Ms. Sacramento, that gives us a very helpful steer on what this is, because when we think of domestic abuse, the first thing I think that comes to mind is somebody who is physically abusive towards somebody else, their partner in many cases. But this is more nuanced, but very serious nevertheless.
Yes, and it's sometimes just as serious or even more serious. What we find in cases of domestic abuse is that usually there will be a combination of coercive behaviour as well as violent behaviour, but usually it's the coercive behaviour that starts the whole process, and it's a process where the victim will feel disempowered to the extent that when they realise that they're victims of domestic abuse, they find it very difficult to leave the situation. Now, coercive behaviour is something which is difficult to pin down. It can be, and it can also be difficult to evidence. And that's why alongside the legislation, we've also published guidance notes for the Royal Gibraltar Police so that they are aware exactly of what it is that they should be looking out for. There's details of what domestic abuse looks like. Domestic abuse, coercive behaviour can take place in many forms. It can be financial abuse. It can be belittling behaviour to the extent that you have no confidence and you doubt yourself. Also, very importantly, is the very extensive training that we have programmed and delivered leading up to this. That training started in September of 2019, where we commissioned training for every single police officer in the Royal Gibraltar Police on domestic abuse generally, but specifically on coercive behaviour. Now, little did we know when we commissioned that in 2019 that there would be a pause in the process because of the pandemic. But of course, we've picked that up. And particularly since November of last year, the training programme that we've rolled out has been incredibly intensive. That has included not only the police, but also the judiciary, the court service, prosecutors, the wider legal profession, and also first responders such as the Gibraltar Health Authority, the Care Agency. We're also involving the Department of Education because I'm particularly mindful of the impact that domestic abuse can have on children and people who witness domestic abuse and children. You know, it can have a long-lasting impact on them, so we want to be able to protect them, help them and support them as much as we can.
To what extent would you say Gibraltar, I mean, you can compare it to other places if you want, but to what extent does Gibraltar have a problem with domestic abuse?
Domestic abuse exists in Gibraltar in the same way that everywhere else. I think that probably domestic abuse is underreported. I am hoping that because of the awareness campaigns that we are running, and particularly because of the assurance that I want to give the members of the public that we are, as first responders, as agencies who deliver services for people who find themselves in situations of domestic abuse, I want people to have the confidence that those who deliver have gone through extensive training and are there to help. And hopefully we are hoping that people who find themselves in this situation and find it difficult to come forward, do come forward, report a crime, or otherwise ask for help in any way.
Okay, so when you say first responders, who's included in this training program that you've delivered? Do you mean sort of like ambulance personnel?
So usually, obviously, if there's a crime to be reported, then it should be reported to the Royal Gibraltar Police because they are the agency tasked with dealing with criminal offences. But not everybody feels ready to report a crime to the police. But that doesn't mean that they can't get help for their situation in any event. So people may disclose to their GP, they may disclose to their social worker, they may disclose to teachers. You know, a parent may have a conversation with a teacher, a child may have a conversation with a teacher. So what we've done is through the creation of a strategic partnership, which I triggered again back in November last year, which involves the Commissioner of the Police, the Chief Executive of the Care Agency, the Director of Education, all the heads of these stakeholder departments, so that there is true partnership working. And now that's important, for example, when we need to refer cases. So everybody who works in these agencies need to know how to refer, who to refer to, and when to refer. So we've got the specialist forms and everything, so that everything is aligned, because I want the public to have the confidence that as agencies in Gibraltar, they will all work together to provide help and to provide support.
Okay, well, let's go to one of the most prominent in that respect, the Royal Gibraltar Police, led by the Commissioner, Richard Ullger, who had this to say about the legislation.
First and foremost, the domestic abuse team come under our public protection unit, and the public protection unit is there to protect the vulnerable, and people who are victims of domestic abuse cases are vulnerable people. So therefore what they do is they spearhead all of our work in respect of investigations, but primarily as well linking up with all our partner agencies so that we can make sure that we're all singing from the same hymn when we're dealing with victims of crime, because we mustn't forget that the victims of crime are the most important people here for us.
The Commissioner of Police, Richard Ullger, who was speaking to GBC at the launch of new domestic abuse legislation now in force, which gives the Royal Gibraltar Police, but also the law courts, more powers. It's created new offences. We're talking to the Justice Minister, Samantha Sacramento. So I suppose the hope is that this legislation might help us as a society to reach people who are currently being abused but have not yet been able to access help.
Essentially, yes, because the strategy that we have as we are developing our holistic national strategy to deal with domestic abuse is to break the cycle. So what we want is, in terms of victims, we want victims to seek help so that they can get themselves out of this abusive cycle. Part of our strategy also involves working with perpetrators because we want to break that cycle of abuse. So we have 3 principal therapeutic services that we offer. So one will be for victims, where we want victims to feel empowered enough to be able to make that change. There will be therapeutic services available to children who witness or suffer domestic abuse themselves, but we also work with perpetrators. Now, the majority of the work with perpetrators is undertaken by the probation services, and they will work with perpetrators whether they're in prison or elsewhere, because that is also a very important piece of work.
So that's rehabilitation? And to get basically somebody who has been the perpetrator, who has inflicted abuse on a significant other, to try and do what we can to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yes, essentially that's it, because it is very important to deal with perpetrators. Perpetrators will themselves have their own issues, so it's important to get to the bottom of those issues and why those issues are causing them to find themselves in a situation where they feel that they have to inflict violent or abusive behaviour on others.
And it doesn't excuse it in any way, but it is a slightly more difficult moment that we find ourselves in, coming out of a pandemic which placed restrictions on what we could do, and then entering now a cost of living crisis in much of the developed world, where things are becoming more expensive and people might be finding themselves under financial pressure. So as you say, understanding the circumstances in that person's life and trying to help that person with that forms part of the rehabilitation process.
Yes, of course, and we're very alive to circumstances. During COVID, for example, we were very mindful of the risk of an increase of domestic abuse, so we had specific contingency measures in place to make sure that victims were not isolated because of the pandemic. We also look at trends as to when, for example, the police receives an increased number of calls for domestic abuse. We analysed trends a couple of years ago, and we saw that the police received an increase of calls on a Friday, at the weekend, when there are circumstances such as a football match. So people who perpetrate domestic abuse sometimes find themselves in situations where they cannot handle the situation, and this is how they lash out. Obviously, people perpetrate domestic abuse for different reasons and in different ways, but an analysis of behaviour shows that usually there are the same patterns.
So this is the culmination of a few years of work. How important was it to? It seems like a slightly dry subject, but and it will be for some people, but I suppose it's nevertheless important. The drafting and the wording of the legislation, I guess, was important because this was a major update, which in all likelihood is not going to be replicated anytime soon.
The legislation itself has undergone extensive work. It's all been undertaken in-house by the Crown Council that work for the government. I'm extremely grateful for them, for their advice and their guidance throughout. And the legislation itself has changed extensively, and that is a reflection of how important consultation is. We first published the command paper in 2020, and all the relevant stakeholders that needed to be involved in the legislation we consulted with the police, with the judiciary, with the members of the public, obviously, through consultation process. We spoke to lawyers in the profession through the Law Council, and their input was extremely useful and extremely relevant from what happens from the other side. And that very much shaped the legislation. So when we presented the bill in November last year, when I published it, the bill was in a different form to the original the original consultation paper that I published before COVID. So during that period, we learned even more. Things changed, and I think we had a much better piece of legislation by the time we published it in November last year. I'm very satisfied with the work that's been done, and because of the collaboration we've had from everyone who's relevant.
Okay, Minister Sacramento, we're almost out of time. I don't know if there's anything else that you had on your sort of list of things that you wanted to mention that you haven't yet, or can I ask you one more question?
Feel free to ask me any questions.
Okay, so your parting message for the public on this domestic abuse legislation, I suppose, in particular, somebody who might be a victim, but maybe also your message for somebody who thinks that they know a victim.
And that's precisely the message that I would have ended on. I want to reassure the public, as victims, I want to reassure them that services are in place and all frontline professionals are available to help. Because of the extensive training that we have, every single agency has domestic abuse champions within them, so they are additionally trained to the generic training that we have offered. But you've made a very important point. Sometimes it's very difficult for victims to come forward. So this invitation is also extended to friends, to family, to neighbours. If they do see someone that they know, someone that they love, in a situation such as this, then I would encourage everyone to call for help. If they don't necessarily want to call the Royal Gibraltar Police in the first instance, then there are many other agencies such as social services, even a GP that they can turn to for advice in the first instance.
Okay. Justice Minister Samantha Sacramento, congratulations on the launch of the legislation and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.